video, I'm going to be focusing on the aspect of auditory attention as it applies to music. And I know that could mean a couple different things, but I'm more focused on when we're listening to music, what is standing out? What is really happening in the brain? And I kind of think that's beautiful, and I wanted to discuss it. So here we go. I know starting with the didgeridoo is a kind of an interesting thing because it's its own instrument, but it's also it makes a lot of different frequencies, right? So that's what I was trying to go for. Like beyond music, music is just notes in frequencies, and I'm just trying to see, well, how does music interact with other sounds, and how does it interact with itself? You still heard that, right? The didgeridoo cut right through the waves and some pretty intense gunfire, might I add. Now, you could attribute some of this just to the power and the strength of the didgeridoo, which, you know, I could agree on some level that the didgeridoo it's making a fuller sound, whereas a wave is spiking, so it might only be noticeable during a certain bit. But I'd say the gunfire, it has a pretty constant rumbling and booming throughout that is near the similar pitch and register that the didgeridoo is at, and you can still hear the didgeridoo. So I want to discuss why this might be. So now that we've done the didgeridoo versus outside non-musical sounds, I want to move over to something I made in a app called MuseScore. So this is a musical composition app where you can make music, write it out, and have it be played in a computer program. So obviously this is not real music. It's not exactly how you'd hear it. There's other sorts of things we have to take into account, but I just wanted to have a little experiment of my own. So first, I just want to play you this track that I've made. I'll show you the score in a second because I think that the visual cues to where the music is would clue you into a little too much. And it would spoil some of the fun for me. So sit back and listen to my composition. So what you just heard was my composition, and I made it purposely messy. I wanted to see what I would hear, what you might hear, if you have any comments on it, like within this short phrase. And there's a few things. You might have heard a moving upwards progression, like this one. Or you might have heard this line played by the trumpets, a horn part, and a violin. And this is probably due to the relatively high nature of some of the notes. Higher notes tend to shine above lower notes, just in terms of power and frequency. So that made it, at least for me, more noticeable throughout. But you can notice that the top bar, flutes, oboes, and clarinets, are playing at a high level. If you know anything about music, the higher you are, the higher the pitch. That's kind of how the sheet works. And still, we don't hear them. And why might that be? Well, maybe the instruments aren't strong enough. Well, let's look at the bottom here. We have violin, cellos, contrabass. This is just double bass and cellos. They say I'm weird. They're playing at a very low frequency. But if I play it for you again, you can still hear them. It's just hard to notice because they are unchanging. And that's another aspect of attention. Even visual attention, change is a very important factor in deciding where your brain goes. Alright, so now I'm going to bring in each part separately. So we're going to start with only a small number of parts. We're going to bring in another after a measure, another after a measure, and then finally the last one. And I want to show this is like the biggest aspect of change in sound grants your brain's attention to it, right? So I'm hoping that this time you might be able to hear each distinct part. Some parts are still hard to hear, but try to find as many as you can. Alright, I hope that time was better. At least for me, it definitely is. It took way less time to notice all of them. And even at the end, I felt like I could hear and make my brain adjust my attention to hear each of them. So now I just want to play each one individually. In case you missed them, here they are. Alright, so now we're going to have all parts play the same melody. And this will let us set a guideline, a baseline, so that you can see the changes in the next bit. Now I'm going to change a few things about this next section. I want you to tell me if you can notice them. I don't know how you tell me, but like... So we had two instruments. We had a bass clarinet and we had a viola continue to play this line. And now you might have noticed this. You might have noticed a little something off. The band wasn't as clean. And that's because someone was playing a completely wrong and different rhythm. Now how about this section? So that one hurt my ears. And I hope you noticed that there was something severely wrong with one of the instruments. And if you didn't, like, if you don't know the instruments or if you can't tell, it was the French horn player. One of them played a half step up. And what this does is it causes an immense amount of tonal dissonance. So tonal dissonance is where the frequencies of multiple sounds don't line up as they're coming out. And if you know anything about music or music theory, which is pretty advanced music, octave sounds, so if you're going up a whole octave or you're changing instruments, they change sounds. So if something's a whole octave above something else, they will not conflict and their wavelengths will overlap. Right, so here's the stupid French horn player. They're a half step up, but it kind of sounds good. Like by itself, there's no tonal dissonance. It just kind of sounds like a regular melody. If you remember the last one, you can clearly tell that it is shifted up, but by itself, your attention notices nothing. Alright, so now I'm going to have the whole band shifted up. And what this is going to show is that it's not just the music that's bad, it's the dissonance that's causing your ears to hurt. So there we go. Now, because we only have 12 notes, and each note's at its own frequency, then music is just playing notes at frequency. They're just sounds, they're bouncing around at these different frequencies and wavelengths. Now, what makes music music is the changes in frequency. No matter what note or what frequency you start with, as long as you're changing it in the correct intervals, going from A to A sharp, all the way up to E sharp, or D to D sharp, all the way up to A sharp, as long as that is uniform, any change, so changing the whole band up a step, makes it still sound just as musical. This is why I might hypothesize that even though all of the instruments are playing the same note, it sounds very harmonious. They're all octavely apart, and different instruments are still producing the same frequency. Alright, so I know I'm talking a lot of music theory here, but let me switch it to a different note that you might understand better, and that's physics. So I'm sure you all have seen sine waves like these ones, and I'm sure you even know about destructive and constructive sine waves. So if waves peak at the same time, then they will peak higher. But if they're peaking at different times, then they will destruct and go at a lower volume. So when you hear an octave, so those are sine waves that are peaking at the same time and they're making a boisterous sound. And every octave, even though it's half frequency, then there's going to be a time when they line up perfectly. So there's going to be a little destructive, but in terms of music, it's going to make it sound better. Whereas the destructive sound that you're finding here, caused by cognitive dissonance, is because they're so close in frequency, but they're just far off enough that it's like tapping hands. I messed up the analogy. Destructive interference is caused, by the dissonance, where you have two pitches that are off. So they line up very rarely. And this happens when you're only off by half a step. That's why you generally almost never hear two half steps played at the same time. They might be right after each other. That can be musical. But at the same time, it's so dissonant that it just ruins a piece of music. So if you relate that to how our body actually processes sound, then you can clue into why this is so terrible, why it's even crunchy. And that's because as the vibrations of, the wave come into your eardrum is going to synchronously vibrate with it. And when you have two destructive forces oscillating at very close frequencies, it makes what can be heard as a terrible sound. If I bumped up the volume, I won't do it, but if I did, it could actively hurt your eardrum. Alright. And then from that step, taking the signals sent from your eardrum into your brain, your brain acts as a filter. So at all moments, usually, our eardrum is vibrating, even from the sound of our own heart. So we have to actively filter out all of that white noise, as you might call it, though all noise is really just noise. Right. So in conclusion, music is effectively a party. Many different noises coming and going, and that's why we usually use dynamics and contrast in order to let the loudest one speak for itself without us having to zone in on it. But it's also part of the cool thing about music is that things can be set at the same level and you can let the listener decide what to listen to. It's one of my favorite things about multiple rhythm, jazz and Latin is that there's so many things going on that even if it's the same measure over and over again, you can still enjoy it for every second because you're focusing on different things and your brain is still, its attention is jumping all over the place because there's so many different things going on, and that's like the main goal of music is to capture someone's attention and not let it go. The most interesting thing is only interesting for so long.